Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Old South Meeting House. My name is Erica Lindemood. I'm the Education Director here. We'd like to welcome you to the second program in our January and February Middays series titled Made by Hand in Boston, The Crafts of Everyday Life. And now I am very pleased to introduce today's presenter, Robert Martello, who will share with us highlights from his ongoing research on Benjamin Franklin's printing career and identity as an artisan.
You might be saying, Benjamin Franklin, what's the approach on Benjamin Franklin? How do we remember him? That's a question I could actually ask everyone here if we just think about the different ways Benjamin Franklin's legacy strikes us. There's so many answers to that question. Talking about my love of technology, we could look at Benjamin Franklin, the inventor. He had so many contributions, from bifocals to the Franklin stove. He invented the glass. He actually perfected and developed the glass harmonica, a musical instrument. And this lower right-hand image is really peculiar. This may be the hardest to figure out. It actually ties into my talk a little bit later on. But this is an odometer. So he invented a mechanical device for measuring distances to be attached to a wagon wheel. And so throughout his career, and we're going to talk briefly about how that affected some of the things that he did later in his career, but Benjamin Franklin, someone we could right away say, oh, sure, Benjamin Franklin, the inventor, absolutely, that's the implication. How about Benjamin Franklin, the scientist? He achieved fame across the world for his work with electricity research, drawing a connection between electricity and lightning. And getting back to my prior slide, the lower left-hand image is a lightning rod. So Benjamin Franklin was not just thinking about principles, but was connecting it to practice, saying if that's how electricity behaves, perhaps we can protect our buildings from lightning strikes. So he was hailed throughout the Western world at this time for his work there. He also charted the Gulf Stream. This is a case where someone who'd made as many transatlantic voyages as he did could just be reading or playing checkers, as many people did, but he'd be taking water temperature measurements and asking the captain about the speed and trying to figure out exactly when does the ship speed up and why is the temperature correlated with that. And again, how do we use that information? How do we use knowledge of this Gulf Stream to speed ships? Maybe we avoid the Gulf Stream in one direction and we get into it in the other direction and we can move across the Atlantic quicker. We could talk about Benjamin Franklin, the diplomat. He spent a lot of his life in England. He also spent a lot of his life in France, advocating on behalf of American colonies or the new American nation. He was an extremely effective diplomat when he did this. He was very good at speaking on behalf of his countrymen, even though he couldn't communicate very effectively given the slow time across the Atlantic. He was very useful there. A lot of people think of him that way. Or, of course, Benjamin Franklin, the statesman. This is a rare individual. He was present at the drafting of the Declaration of Independence. He was on that committee that was doing that. And he was present in the Constitutional Convention, writing the American Constitution to replace the Articles of Confederation. This is someone who was there. He was at the center of all these events. So when I was thinking about Benjamin Franklin, actually, and as I said, I started with my work in Paul Revere, and I was looking at other topics. What got me hooked on this research project was when at one point I came across a reference to Benjamin Franklin's last will and testament. So this is someone who's thinking about his legacy, how he wants to be remembered after he's gone in the world. I just showed you 4 slides showing all these different ways we might remember him. So how does Benjamin Franklin begin his last will and testament? The answer is, I, Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia, printer. So this is someone who's very aware of how he's being perceived, how he wants to be remembered. Why is printer coming in? Of all the things I mentioned, why is this image of Benjamin Franklin in the print shop, the one that he's putting out there? So that was what hooked me. And then I started unraveling this and finding how important this was. And I'd like to talk to you briefly about that today. A subsidiary goal is, I feel like we always think of Benjamin Franklin of Philadelphia. Maybe it's time for Boston to get a little bit more of Benjamin Franklin here. I think we deserve to remember some of what he did here in our town, and that's partly why I'm so thrilled to be here in the Old South Meeting House today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. A last precursor point of information is just that I have just begun my research, so I'm going to be particularly easy to stump during the question and answer session. And that said, I urge you to do that. I need to get these questions. I need to keep digging. But I spent a summer researching this, and it's a pleasure to read Benjamin Franklin's writing, just to immerse yourself in this great person's writing and thinking. And so I'm just getting that started, and I've learned a lot, and I'm going to share that with you. But just to flag this, that I've got a lot more to research as well. Okay, let's get going. So I'll just briefly start the story with Benjamin Franklin's father, Josiah Franklin. He was born in Ecton, England in 1657. This was a small, sort of like a little hamlet in England. He was in a large family. Benjamin Franklin in later years researched his own family, and Benjamin Franklin in the autobiography wrote, "I am the youngest son of the youngest son for 5 generations back." So Josiah Franklin was the youngest son of a large family, and as such, he didn't stand to inherit very much. This was a family that had certain quasi-prosperous members. They weren't a booming family, but they had some members who were more prosperous than others. Josiah moved to some urban centers where he worked as a silk dyer, along with one of his older brothers. He was known for this beautiful shade of red. People, that sort of stood him out. He's that beautiful red produced by the Franklin shop. But even with this good praise, he wasn't really doing that well economically. And as many did at that time, he identified America as a location where he might be able to travel and have some better economic opportunities. He was married to his first wife at that time. He had 2 young children. And so he came to Boston in the year 1683. And interestingly, he did not dye silks when he came to America. This was a shrewd decision on his part. This time, Boston was very much a Puritan town, something ostentatious, even as beautiful as his red was. Silks were not something the population here would be buying or encouraging, wearing that kind of showy fabric. So Josiah stepped down the artisan hierarchy to produce more commonplace items. He was a tallow chandler, basically a candle maker, excuse me, and a soap maker. These were items that most people knew how to make in their own house, but they didn't because it was very labor intensive and very smelly, right? So these were just the fumes from these processes made it just very unpleasant. It was a dirty, hot, smelly job. So if you imagine someone doing that as a living, it's telling you something. He's really providing a service. He's trying to, provide for the town, but he's not really putting himself in the forefront, right, of the most visible artisans. However, it was a steady mode of employment. There was a pretty steady market for these things. And so he was able to support his family. Why would this be on his mind? Because he had, over the course of his 2 wives, he had 17 children. His first wife gave birth to 7 children. She died shortly after the birth of the 7th. He remarried fairly quickly. He remarried Benjamin Franklin's mother, who had 10 children of her own. Benjamin Franklin's mother was Abiah Franklin, right? So anyway, Benjamin Franklin is now entering the stage. So I've set things up here. He was born in humble location on Milk Street. I'll talk about that in a second, but he was born on January 17th. That's partly why I was so excited to be presenting at this time. His birthday was basically 6 days ago, so we're imagining the time of year. In the year 1706, so he was born on Milk Street, one of 17 siblings, as I mentioned. He was the 15th, he was on the young end, so the 15th out of these 17 children, not all of whom lived to grow past childhood, which was common at the time, a lot of infant mortality at that time. But he was the 10th of the sons, and the youngest of all the sons, and was known as a very precocious boy. He wrote in his autobiography, "I can't remember a time when I was not able to read." That's actually not that controversial a statement. Most of our memory is hooked to reading, but he's saying that most of his family were talking about, even as a young child, he was very bright, he was reading early, he was speaking a lot about things that would be seen to be more mature than his age, describing himself, and seems to have a reputation of being very precocious, very, very smart. His father described him once as, "You're going to be my tithe to the church. I'm going to let you enter the clergy and give back to the church." And as someone who's heading towards the church as a career, some education was helpful. So Benjamin Franklin was enrolled in the South Grammar School, which is now the Boston School of Latin. There's a statue of Benjamin Franklin there right now in the original site of the Boston Latin School. I say here one amazing year of education for him, because in that 1 year that he spent in this school, he entered the common schoolhouse where all the children were being educated together. Very quickly, the instructor realized he was well above the grade level that he should have been in, so he was advanced 1 level immediately as a corrective activity. And then throughout the course of that year, he basically finished the whole course of study and was promoted to the next course of year and almost finished that one. So in 1 year, he was flying through the curriculum. You could just see this boy hungry. He was loving reading. He described it as a stimulating, wonderful opportunity, exposed to all these ideas. Sadly, his father then decided, "This is not the career for you. We can't afford this. We better think about a more working class direction for you. And so for that reason, he was pulled out of the school after 1 year. He had a second year of education at Brownell School. This was more of a typical education at the time, where you'd work in a small setting with one instructor, with a couple of students, learning to read, to do arithmetic. Benjamin Franklin enjoyed that year as well. He looked back on that fondly afterwards and just said, look, I learned a lot in that year as well. But that's the end of his formal education. He had those 2 years, and then at that point his father said, look, we better think about a trade for you at this point. Now, I mentioned before, he was born on Milk Street, and it's very fun. You could tell a lot about a town when you see how do we preserve these birthplaces of these famous individuals. So what does Benjamin Franklin's birthplace look like today? Whoops, right, so, sorry. There's a Sir Speedy there, right? So this is it. So Boston was developed over the years. Actually, though, I'm looking at that Sir Speedy right now out this window, right? So we are right here. This Old South Meeting House. This was where Benjamin Franklin was baptized. He was born right there. And actually, this picture isn't as bleak as I painted it. Yes, this is his birthplace, but Boston did something for him. If we look more carefully at this picture, look at this part of the picture, we actually see birthplace of Franklin there. So we can remember it. And this is so like as a piece of homework on the way out today, just take a look across the street. Just sort of wave to Benjamin Franklin's birthplace there. The next time you're walking the Freedom Trail, I want everybody to remember, you know, it all happened right here. We're right there at the center of all this excitement. Okay, so his father, moving back on, right, his father said, look, let's think about a trade for you. We have to support the family. I don't think I could support you as you're learning to enter the clergy. I think we better think of something more practical. What can you do? The obvious choice at this time was to work for your father. A lot of artisans did this. They would bring their sons in as an apprentice. It would help around the shop. You could educate them that way. Benjamin said, no way. I can't stand these fumes. And he said, my mind is just dying. I just can't do this monotonous work. I'm sorry, I can't do it. And so Benjamin said, hey, maybe I could be a sailor. And his father said, no, I don't want that. We already have one older brother in that field, and I think it's risky. I don't want that. He later said that he used the threat of running away to become a sailor as leverage on his father to kind of help his father consider other trades for him. So he said, okay, if you're not going to be a sailor, you won't help me in the shop, what should I do with my son? His father, Josiah, took him on a tour of these different trades. He looked at different shops. He was very impressed by a lot of these different trades. He said, I always enjoyed watching skilled craftsmen at work. None of these really grabbed him that much. One obvious choice was to become a cutler, someone who makes cutlery, makes knives, sharpens knives, makes other utensils. And they had a cousin in Boston in this business. So that seemed like an interesting connection, and it got pretty far in the negotiations. But the cousin asked Josiah Franklin to give him 10 pounds as sort of a fee to train Benjamin as an apprentice. And Benjamin Franklin's father thought this was completely unacceptable. This was a breach of family connections. I should not be paying, my own nephew to be training my son. Forget it. So his father pulled the plug on the deal, said, that's not allowed. It's out. But they said, let's keep it in the family in a different way. Maybe you could become an apprentice for your brother James. And this seemed like it was a good match. This is one where there were different people agreeing. In Benjamin Franklin's words, this bookish inclination at length determined my father to make me a printer, though he had already one son of that profession. So even though his father, you can imagine his father trying to diversify the Franklins, but in this case he said, no, you know what, you love books and printing might be good for you. Let's do that. And so this, in retrospect, makes perfect sense when you think of a mind like Benjamin Franklin's. But at the time, I'm showing this to show it really could have gone a different way. And imagine how American history would be different if had that been the case. So Franklin now proceeded with a different stage of his education, the apprenticeship education, which was, again, very common at the time. So he began at the age of 12. The year was 1718, for those of you who are keeping track. He signed papers for a 9-year apprenticeship period. This was unusually long. Usually it was more like 7 years. That later became a sticking point for him. Boston had 5 printers, including Ben's older brother, James. All the other colonies combined had 2. So it tells you something about the town of Boston. It's supporting this big population of printers for that day and age. We look at what printers do. That kind of explains why we had so many. Some of what printers did, they would print books and almanacs, sometimes for hire. So someone would say, Mr. Franklin, could you print this book for me and give me the copies and I'll sell them? Other times the printer would say, I think I can make a lot of money selling this book, so I'll print it on my own account and sell it, and I'll keep all the profits. They also would do print jobs for people. If someone said, I would like a brochure, a pamphlet, or something like that, they would go to the printer, and then the printer would be happy to oblige. Or the printer might come up with something like a newspaper, which is a product that they control completely, and they would print that periodically and distribute it. So these are all the different works that a printer would do. And you would have to have a variety of income sources to stay solvent. So printers were really trying to branch out and meet all of these needs. And the apprentices of the printers would basically learn all the tricks of the trade. And so I say here, right, some of these different positions, I'm going to talk a little bit about being a compositor or a pressman. Being a beater, that's the job of just inking. You basically have a little thing called a beater that you dip in ink and you put it on the type and you ink it up. But very briefly, a compositor, or the stage of composition, is the idea of putting the type together. So you're basically forming these individual letters. And if you look at the left image, you could see a box of type where everything would be sorted alphabetically. So you'd have to be very good at just reaching in, getting the letters, putting them together line by line, and forming the page that you're planning on printing. So this requires some sense of being literary. You need to be able to spell and do this quickly and accurately. And so that's one stage. The pressman is the other part of the job. This is the manual side, where you're actually pulling the lever, you're pressing the paper onto the ink. So you're really doing that repeatedly. There's a bit of an art to this. You have to put the right amount of pressure, 15 seconds or so, to make sure you get enough ink to make an impression, not too much to go through the paper, because they use both sides of the paper at that time. So if you went through the paper, you can't use the other side. It would not be readable. An apprentice would often start their learning by hanging sheets to dry. That'd be one of the first jobs you do. Say, as the pressman is pulling out sheets, the apprentice will take them. You could see in the right-hand image here, sheets drying on a rack in the background. So the apprentice would be learning that and gradually learning these other tasks. In England, the print shops were a little bit larger, and printers could specialize. A printer might be only a pressman or only a compositor. In America, you had to basically do it all. So you didn't have as much labor, so the printers had a much broader education, would learn all stages of it. So imagine young Benjamin at his brother's elbow learning these different tasks over the years. James decided, as many printers did, that the best way to really make a name for himself was to put out his own newspaper. His was called the New England Courant. He started this in the year 1721. And one shame about the Ben Franklin story, one of the few sad things, is that Ben Franklin's great rising star eclipsed that of his brother, who did something very important. Many literary historians say that James Franklin, so Ben's brother, deserves a lot of credit for basically changing newspapers or creating the first modern newspaper. Before this time, newspapers were purely factual. So I say here, what are some of the things you'd find in a newspaper? A newspaper would usually be one sheet of paper, both sides. It would have a lot of news. You maybe would have some foreign news, something reprinted verbatim from a newspaper that happened to make its way across the Atlantic. It could be months old. So just some random foreign news article might be in there, but also things about arrival times or departure times of ships in the harbor. If the government passed an act, you might have the text of that act in the newspaper, obituaries. So very factual information there. Just very much like, here's some information you might want to know if you're in Boston. The Courant was America's first real newspaper, or in one historian's words, the first literary, lively, entertaining, humorous, and proto-nationalistic American newspaper. So there's a lot there, right? So he's saying, look at this. James Franklin is saying, do people really just want to read obituaries and shipping schedules and news about random European countries that might be months or a year out of date? Maybe they want something local. This was a revolutionary, radical idea at the time. So Ben was able, but given this approach that James had, Ben really was not just writing articles and reproducing death notices, but was able to actually practice some writing. In particular, some of us know that Benjamin Franklin is known for one persona he adopted, silence do good. So what Ben did was he wanted to be a writer in the newspaper, and his brother said, no, you're an apprentice, you're too young, you can't do that. So Ben said, okay, if I can't do it under my own name, maybe I'll take on a persona. So he wrote letters as if he was a widowed woman living in the area who had a lot of opinions about local events. And he wrote a very compelling set of letters that he slipped under the door when no one else was there, as if they were arriving from someone in one of the suburbs, basically saying, hello, my name is Silence Do Good. I am a widowed woman, and I have this view about education, and then would go on. These letters were compelling reading. They were wonderful. I shouldn't use the past tense. They still are. I cannot get enough of them. So Benjamin is just, at the age of 15, he is just fantastic at putting himself in this mindset and convincing others. Later, when he admitted that he was Silence Dogood, his brother was furious. And this was one of the many things that led to a separation between them. In addition to these letters from people in the town, a newspaper like The Current would have an opinion about different topics. There was a debate over whether paper currency was a good idea or a bad idea. So The Current reprinted ideas about that, weighed in on them. The idea about the government, the Crown of England having a right to pine trees, how do locals feel about that? Smallpox was a very hot button topic, one of the first ones covered in The Current. Do we think smallpox is appropriate, or are we going to be killing people? The Current took a position very strongly saying we should not be inoculating, and it was against the clergy in that position. So you could see the controversies here. We now have a newspaper that people might be compelled to read. And this is, like I said, I can't emphasize enough how radical this idea was and how visionary it was of James to go in this direction. So this sounds exciting for Ben, but actually it wasn't all roses. Ben had a lot of trouble working there. He was precocious, as I said, as a young child. This only increased when he realized he was naturally gifted. He was very smart. He had strong opinions. This was made worse by the fact that his boss, his supervisor, was his big brother. So you could just imagine James trying to enforce some authority and Ben saying, oh, be quiet, right? And then James saying, you can't talk to me like that. And so Ben's sort of natural impertinence, right, actually led to real arguments, and James at times would hit him, would just fight him, right, just say, you can't talk to me like that. And Ben was saying, I'm not going to put up with this. This is unacceptable. I can't work here anymore. By the way, I'm really shortening this part of the story. There's a lot of richness there I'd love to talk about, but I want to at least get us to Philadelphia before I run out of time. So I've got to move forward. But his long time his stay under his brother's tutelage was winding down when he realized, I can't work here anymore. We don't get along. Finally, at the age of 17, Ben said, I got to leave here. I can't work for you anymore. However, he was bound by this indenture, by the apprenticeship agreement. He sort of floated the idea with other printers, maybe I could work for someone else in the town of Boston. No. The printers stuck together, right? They said, if you run away from your master craftsman, my apprentice might do the same. So forget it. You stick with your person that you're working with, Ben. You cannot leave him and work with someone else. So he realized quickly, I can't work in Boston. My brother will make sure I'll never work anywhere here. So what he did was he sold some of his precious, precious books, one of his his prized possessions, to raise a little bit of money to buy a ticket on a boat, right, heading out. He had to sort of lie to get onto the boat. It was very funny. He had to use his wits, right? Because if people thought he was an escaped apprentice, he could be jailed for that. That was taken very seriously. But he managed to con the captain, and he caught a boat to New York City, where he thought he could get a printing job there. There was a printer there, William Bradford, an elderly printer, very successful, who said, I'm sorry, I don't have any openings right now, but you seem really gifted. He really was taken with Ben. And he said, my son is a printer in Philadelphia. He might be looking for work. Why don't you head a little bit further south? So Ben continued his journey from Boston to New York, then to Philadelphia. And so we're just sort of seeing him heading out. So Philadelphia at the time. And I had to show some images here from Ben Franklin's autobiography. One of the most charming stories he tells is of his arrival in Philadelphia, arriving with basically all of his clothes stuffed into the pockets of his overcoat. And he was hungry, so he had 1 penny, and he spent it on bread. But he didn't know the price of bread, and so he ended up with 3 giant loaves of bread. And he describes walking around town with a loaf under each arm, munching on the third. And then he says, and one of the people who said that I made a ridiculous appearance was my future wife, Deborah, right? Deborah Reed at the time. So every artist loves to capture this moment of young Ben walking around with the bread and Deborah Reed looking on saying, who is this oaf? Not knowing she's going to marry him someday. But anyway, this is one of the lovely tales he spins in the autobiography, just charming as a writer. But let's imagine now we're back in the mindset of 17-year-old Benjamin Franklin. He's just escaped. He's actually now a runaway. He's broken the law by doing this. He's in Philadelphia. Of course, he's not going to say I'm an apprentice, right? That would instantly be a big problem. So he says, oh, no, I'm old. No, I'm a journeyman. I have finished my apprenticeship. I've graduated, and I'm ready to take on work for hire now. So I'd like to work for someone here. He found there were 2 printers there. There wasn't just one. So as I mentioned, Andrew Bradford, the son of William, who was in New York, was doing quite well as a printer in Philadelphia. Unfortunately, he was also set with labor. He didn't need any help. He also was a printer of a newspaper. He was the established printer at the time. Ben Franklin later reflected and said that he considered Andrew Bradford illiterate. And by that he meant this guy just was not a good writer. He just wasn't good at being a copy editor or anything like that. So Franklin not impressed with Andrew Bradford. And this was the prosperous of the 2 printers. The newer printer was Samuel Keimer. So he was recently arrived from England where he had been trained. And he was boarding at the house of John Reed, the father of Deborah Reed, who would later be Deborah Franklin, Franklin's future wife. And Franklin described his equipment as an old shattered press and one small worn-out font of type. And as today, when you use your word processor, you have different fonts. They would often usually have different font sizes, different italics or non-italics. This guy just had one font, and the press isn't even working that well. But at least he had a press. That took a lot of money to get started, so he brought it with him from England. And Franklin also sort of condescendingly said, though something of a scholar, Samuel Keimer was a mere compositor, knowing nothing of press work. So you see right now he's saying, oh, he was trained in England, so he's good at composition, but he's not good at operating the press. Who is this guy? So this is a 17-year-old, right, having all these judgments. But as is often the case with Ben Franklin, he's right. You know, he's looking at these people as a 17-year-old, and he truthfully is more skilled than both of them in just about every aspect of the trade. However, he's lacking in capital. He doesn't have any funds. So he says, look, I'm going to work for Keimer. I have no choice. That's the only choice I have. Let me work for him. Maybe someday I could go into business for myself. I know I'm short on time here, so I'm not going to tell a crazy story about Franklin taking a 2-year detour to London as an 18-year-old. Maybe we could talk about it later. It's crazy. It's amazing. If I just told you this, you'd say, Rob, stop the fiction, please. You know, that doesn't happen in real life, right? But truth be told, he goes to England. He comes back from England, continues working for Keimer for a while, and eventually fulfills his plan. He earns some money printing. And eventually he has enough with a partner of his, a friend of his who's also, who's got a father with some money, gets his own print shop. So we're thinking, at last, this great talent, he could sort of be free and not be just helping other people. He really wanted to start a newspaper. He started making arrangements to start his own newspaper. But word leaked out to Samuel Keimer that Franklin was going to start his own newspaper. Keimer then does something kind of spiteful. He says, oh, you want to start a newspaper? Not if I start a new one first, because we already have Andrew Bradford's newspaper. If I start one, then there'll be 2 newspapers in town. We can't support a third. He's kind of boxing Franklin out. Franklin was furious when he heard about this. He never forgave him. Keimer came up with the title, The Universal Instructor in All Arts and Sciences and Pennsylvania Gazette. So that was the title of his newspaper. You get a sense here this guy may not be that good at this idea of publicizing your work, at really appealing to people. His other idea, Keimer's other idea, is he said, hey, if I make a newspaper, how about each issue will print 1 page of an encyclopedia? So that's partly why he says the instructor in all arts and sciences. And would you imagine reading an encyclopedia alphabetically 1 page at a time, right? So this is sort of the big chunk of the newspaper each day is just the next page that you happen to be at in the newspaper. Franklin then decided that he had had enough, so he began writing a few anonymous essays in Andrew Bradford's newspaper, mocking Keimer's newspaper, saying, who writes a newspaper, that's an encyclopedia alphabetically? What's up with that? And just these satirical, dead on target, brutally effective essays that just make a mockery of Keimer's attempt. And as a result of this, Keimer basically sells out. He says, that's it, I can't work anymore. And so Franklin says, oh, I might be interested in purchasing the rights of this newspaper. And so he says for a song, he was able to buy it. Franklin is smart enough to say, I'm not working with this crazy title. But he likes 2 words in this title. So Franklin says, now we're going to call it the Pennsylvania Gazette. So he saved the best 2 words from that long monstrosity of a title. And finally, we're seeing Franklin able to do what he was waiting his whole life to do. So now he could do it all. He can do the printing. He can decide what stories are worth reporting. He could use his great wit to write in this creative manner. This newspaper became a success. So this newspaper was compelling. It was lively. Not quite as controversial as the New England Courant was. He learned his lesson from his brother getting into a few scrapes with the law when he was getting a little too close to criticizing authority, but still took on controversies in this paper in an engaging way. Franklin now has made it. He's now becoming a very successful printer. And I'm going to end in a minute or two. I'm just going to quickly fast forward through all the different things he did in Pennsylvania. He and his wife, so in 1730, he begins a common law marriage with Deborah Reed, right? There's interesting family issues there I'd be happy to talk about later. But one thing that they did, which many printers did, was they operated a little bit of a general goods shop, which they could now get a little bit of serendipity. They could advertise their wares in the newspaper, right? And they said, hey, come by the site where we print this newspaper. We're also selling legal papers, ink, and look at this list of goods here, books and maps, cheese, codfish, soap, right? So he's basically saying, what do you need in this town? I could provide it for you. I'm going to buy and sell. He's using some of his shrewdness to do this. I mentioned Deborah Reed here because his wife actually played a big role in the shop. She did a lot of buying and selling. She was pretty good at figuring out what people wanted in the town. So of all the things Franklin did, she was most active in the shop, which was a nice stream of income. Franklin, though, is very entrepreneurial. He's brilliant. He's a brilliant entrepreneur. He's very gifted at figuring out what do people want, what can I provide. So he says, you know what, printers have newspapers. They also sometimes put out almanacs. And I can really do a good job of this. So we've all heard of Poor Richard. He did his almanac. He became the postmaster. Remember I talked about the odometer? He invented the odometer in part because he wanted to see what routes the different postal wagons were taking and see if he could do a better job of figuring out some good routes and mapping some of the area. But a lot of printers became postmasters. Again, there was a nice alliance there in terms of trying to say, I need a postal service to deliver my newspapers. And it was common practice for the postmaster to say, deliver my newspapers for free and don't deliver anyone else's newspapers. So that was used against Franklin when he was a printer who was not the postmaster. He had to bribe individual postal carriers to carry his newspapers. When he became postmaster, he did that to his rivals. He said, don't carry their papers, just carry mine for free. And so he was a postmaster. He eventually became the deputy postmaster of all the colonies, although he started out local. And in conclusion, I'm just going to talk about, as he's adding new businesses, we're seeing what we today call vertical and horizontal integration. So Franklin is so gifted that he's saying, printers need raw materials. They need paper, they need ink. Why should I be dependent upon other places? I'm going to buy my own paper companies and my own ink fabrication plants, and therefore just have a direct route. And he did that. He founded a lot of paper plants, and he got his own paper really cheaply. Franklin did another great innovation. He had journeymen that he would send to other towns. So he would say, he would have an apprentice who he trained. When his apprentice graduated, he'd say, would you like to go into business in South Carolina, in Hartford, anywhere but here? He doesn't want them to compete. And he'd say, I'll buy you a press, and you give me 1/3 of your profits for 6 years. And at the end of it, you can buy the press back from me, or we could renew for another 6 years. So he basically franchised out. And so he's getting profit streams from different printers, and he's using those printers to sell his own newspapers or his almanacs. Brilliant, brilliantly done. And in addition to the post office and these other printers, he made alliances with booksellers. So we're seeing this great entrepreneurial spirit here. And so in 1748, he basically retires from printing. He has this portrait that looks unlike any other portrait in his life, where he's saying, look at me, I'm a gentleman now. Now, when I say retires, that just means he's not in the shop. He still occasionally writes. He still is getting profits from all these different shops. But he's saying, I'm not getting my hands dirty anymore. I'm a gentleman. I'm a man of science now. And thus began the next stage of his career. So he very intentionally leaves behind his artisan identity so that he could be seen as a statesman, as someone bigger than that. So in my book, I'm trying to say, if we look at Franklin and all these great achievements, is there a way we might see some traces of the printer when we look at the statesman and all these later achievements? And I think I'll leave us there with that thought. If we could just look back to his early years, we could see that this great founding father really was shaped by these artisan experiences and by being a printer in specific. And let me stop there. Thank you very much for listening. I appreciate that. Oh, thank you so much.
That was great. You'll have to go back and tell us the story about London. What happened in those 2 years?
The crazy London story. So it just shows us something about how Franklin was perceived. At one point when he was basically 17 years old in Philadelphia, he met the governor of Pennsylvania, who was taken with him, who said, wow, you're so witty, you're so knowledgeable. And Franklin said, I know, but I have to work for Keimer. And you can imagine Franklin just bad-mouthing the existing printers, right? And so the Governor Keith of Pennsylvania said, I would like to see you run your own shop. And I'd like to help you do that. That would be good for our colony. Governor Keith said, Ben, I'll give you an offer. What if I send you to England? I will give you a note of credit when you get there. There'll be a letter of credit waiting for you and a letter of introduction waiting for you. You could use these to buy what you need. You could buy a printing press, some type, maybe hire some laborers, then come back here and start your own print shop. Okay, so imagine, I've described Ben Franklin, he's very ambitious. He said, this is the best thing that ever happened to me. I would love to do that. Let's do this. So Benjamin Franklin got on a ship to London. He went over there. He lands in London. He's all excited. When he arrives, a merchant who he's happened to be telling his story to said, Governor Keith is infamous for just making these promises that he can't keep. He doesn't have any letter of credit. He doesn't have any credit. He's in debt. He can't pay for anything. And sure enough, so then Benjamin Franklin said, okay, where's my letter of introduction? None of this happened. So he finds it. So now he had a one-way ticket to London. He arrives in London. There is no letter of credit waiting for him. There is no letter of introduction waiting for him. He's just a 17-year-old in London for the first time. So Franklin said, what the heck do I do? Right? How do I get home? What am I supposed to do? He ended up working in a print shop there, where, as is the story of his life, he impressed everyone around him. So the printers there were more specialized in being a compositor or a pressman. He could do both. So he describes how he was able to just fulfill different roles in the shop to basically rise through the ranks pretty quickly. He loved it there in England. He loved the culture there. So he was planning to just work there for a while and save up some money to get back home. But he stayed for 2 years, it ended up, right? So he was sort of getting money, getting a lot of practice in writing. He put out a pamphlet or two under his own name. He developed his skills even further. But he had a lot of fun over there in England before finally he found that merchant who he met, right, Thomas Denham, right? And he said, look, I think I'd like to return back home. Could you help pay my passage back to Philadelphia, and maybe I could work for you as a merchant, and I could become a merchant someday. So he came back to Philadelphia, but this friend of his, he described him as a great mentor, like a second father to him, passed away shortly after. So he's back in Philadelphia, planning to start a new career as a merchant. That fades for him, and he ends up working back for Keimer again, right? So he starts out as a 17-year-old working for Samuel Keimer. This crazy voyage to London that meant nothing, that was all basically a lie, returns home. His merchant direction does not fall through. He returns to being an employee in a print shop again. So it's just an amazing two-year detour. And if you say, well, who is this kook who lied to you about that? It was the governor of the colony. So of all the people to just make this promise that he had no intention of backing up, why would a governor be doing that? But that's sort of the story of Governor Keith at the time. So I just find that the truth is stranger than fiction sometimes. If I made up a story like that, you'd say, come on, Rob, governors don't do that. You don't get lied to and go over there. So there's the London story.
I just wanted to know how far into Benjamin Franklin's life you intend to go.
I'm sorry, how far
into his life do you intend to go?
Do I intend to go in my research? So that's a great question. The question is, how far do I plan to take my study? So I will absolutely focus upon his printing career, going through the portrait, going through 1748. So in great detail, I want to tell that story. I plan to connect his printing work somewhat to what he did later. So I know that later in his life, he was very proud of being a printer. We saw that in his last will and testament. When he was a diplomat in France, he had a small printing press there that he was very proud of. He bought a little, sort of like a hand-managed printing press that he used sometimes for novelty printing, right, just to print something funny, especially these women that he might have been interested in. He was writing little funny poems for them. But he also printed official documents on that. And he would say that he was very proud that he was putting the type himself and pulling the press. So you just see him there still kind of excited about that. So I plan to absolutely narrate the story of his early life and then connect it to some of his later events without telling his whole story. And I was mentioning before to some people in the audience that there are a lot, unlike my Paul Revere research, there are a lot of works on Benjamin Franklin. There are a few about Paul Revere, don't get me wrong. There are some works out there about Paul Revere, but the field was wider open. For Benjamin Franklin, the shelf is crowded with Benjamin Franklin biographies. And when I said that I started my research, one of my first research steps was to say, has this been done? Am I just going to be retracing someone else's work? And the answer is many of these great biographies out there talk about his printing, and they give some information, but I think you can go deeper and find some really productive material. So that is where I'm going to focus. I'm going to drill deep into the early years, definitely the Boston story, definitely the Philadelphia story, and then kind of see how that plays out and how it affects the rest of his life in a little bit less. Then at that point, yes, I will no longer have the research in progress sign up.
As a stamp collector in my youth, I was interested in your Franklin stamp, which obviously was post-independence. I was wondering if when he was running a post office, Franklin used stamps, and do any of them survive? Or were they other means of paying for a letter than a postage stamp?
Well, that's a great question. See, so you are probably more of an expert than I am. From what I understand, so a stamp, as we know this term stamp today, something you would attach to the letter, I don't believe that that was the way they paid, but I am not positive about that now. I think it was much more of a case of paying the postmaster in some way, and then the letter would just be taken to its offer. But don't quote me on that. That's something where I really want to go into his postal activities more, because I think this entrepreneurial spirit of his is visible in activities like that, in the connection. But I think it was more of an arrangement, and he might have had special deals with certain people. Like I said, his own work was, his own newspapers were sent for free, so no stamp needed whatsoever. Someone else's, if it's a rival to his, no amount of money would work. He doesn't want to carry your work, your mail whatsoever. And then things in between. There were some rates and all that, but I don't think there were stamps.
Fabulous.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you
all
very
for
much.
coming.
Thank you. Great audience.
like Richard Harrison were chased around Boston town, refused to be able to collect taxes like they were supposed to. Men like Thomas Hutchinson. His home, before he was actually our governor, when he was lieutenant governor of Boston town, it was torn down by the Sons of Liberty, granted before you stood in this town, Boston, before you stood here in 1765.